So, Apollonius of Rhodes, he definitely did not write just another simple adventure story. Instead, he completely flips the script on traditional heroic epics. He's intentionally subverting them, measuring every single plot advancement against this devastating ledger of human and psychological grief. In this explainer, we're diving into a first-hand scholarly critique of the ancient Hellenistic epic, the Argonautica. We'll see exactly how this foundational text completely rejects the old heroic economy. The idea where victory just automatically outweighs the price of the journey, and instead it actually frames grabbing that golden fleece as a trigger for absolute collective devastation.
Okay, so we've got a lot of ground to cover today. We're going to break this down into 6 parts. First, the thematic thesis, then the historical context, the literary composition, the ethical framework, character arcs, and finally we'll wrap up with the text's enduring legacy.
Right, let's jump straight into part 1, the introduction and thematic thesis. Now, the Argonautica really isn't just a tale about securing some mythical prize. Apollonius actually restructures the entire concept of what heroism costs. He exposes how the demand for the Golden Fleece isn't about isolated glory at all. It's a catalyst for profound collective devastation. Right from the opening lines, the text makes it incredibly clear that this expedition is steeped in peril, demanding a severe, almost unbearable toll from the crew way before they even touch the shores of Colchis. He's systematically weighing every single nautical and narrative step against what we can basically call a ledger of grief. Just look at the staggering cost exacted on this crew. We're talking irreversible human casualties, immense psychological trauma, the complete betrayal of social and familial bonds, and this constant, heavy religious debt. It's a total refusal of the older, archaic paradigm. In this epic, the sheer, crushing price of the journey chronically overshadows whatever victory waits at the destination.
Which brings us to part 2, the historical and cultural context.
You see, the older Homeric tradition loved to celebrate the solitary, individualistic muscle of a mythic champion. But Apollonius, he intentionally subverts that entire idea. The Argonautica reflects a very different Hellenistic world, one that absolutely required diplomacy and highly integrated collaborative communities. This big historical shift toward collective survival is perfectly mirrored in the incredibly diverse, specialized assembly of the Argonauts themselves. Because they don't have that single invincible champion to fall back on, the crew's success depends entirely on a specialized team. Think about it. The inclusion of figures like Orpheus, whose music can literally charm nature itself, or Tiphys, the incredibly skilled helmsman favored by Athena, that structurally demonstrates a brand new reality. Raw, individualistic muscle just wasn't a viable method for survival in the Hellenistic worldview anymore. Triumphs are now the result of a coordinated network of distinctly specialized people working together. Moving on to part 3, let's talk about literary composition and style. Let's consider how he uses the ancient concept of nostos. Now, in earlier epics, the homeward voyage definitely exacts a heavy toll, but it ultimately highlights a single survivor's individual return. Well, Apollonius inverts this completely. His text lingers on distributed grief and a shared collective tragedy. The losses don't just prop up one hero's resilience, they're distributed across the entire company, and this fundamentally alters the whole literary architecture of the return journey. Just listen to Jason's specific dialogue in Book 2. He says, "I am wrapped in excessive fear and cares unbearable." I mean, wow. Unlike traditional heroes who are defined by this stoic, unflinching bravery, Jason is defined by profound psychological realism. The guy weeps, he experiences severe anxiety, and he's constantly weighed down by the immense pressure of his responsibility. This kind of emotional vulnerability systematically shatters the traditional heroic archetype. And Apollonius is setting up a really deliberate foil here. On one side, you have Heracles, who represents that older archetype of solitary, nonverbal, physical dominance. This is a guy who can row the ship all by himself or literally uproot pine trees with his bare hands. But on the other side, we have Jason, who actually manages his crew through anxiety-driven democratic dialogue. It's a complete 180-degree shift from raw brutality to civilized technique and communal management. Okay, let's dive into part 4, the ethical and philosophical framework. So glory and renown, kleos, these are not presented as pure, unambiguous triumphs here. Actually, the Argonautica presents kleos as a deeply tainted prize.
The god's favor is demonstrably fickle, and the text frames the entire expedition as operating within this really dark moral economy. Every single spatial transition, every narrative advance, it all demands an unsentimental, bloody religious compensation and these elaborate propitiatory rituals. And unfortunately, this dark economy is paid out in human lives. We see the systematic, physical toll of the journey unfold. Idmon the seer gets killed by a boar, Mopsus dies from a serpent bite, Tiphys is lost to sickness, Canthus is slain in Libya. But honestly, the absolute peak example of the quest's blinding, senseless cost happens at the Mount of Bears in Book 5. It's the tragic, accidental night slaughter of their incredibly hospitable hosts, King Cyzicus and the Dolians. These ethical compromises finally culminate in Book 4, with the completely treacherous murder of Medea's brother, Absyrtus. Jason and Medea actually conspire to lure him into an ambush, striking him down just to ensure their own escape. And this right here exposes the foundational societal betrayals that entirely compromise the acquisition of the Golden Fleece. The prize is basically purchased through this web of guile and bloodshed that absolutely no divine favor could ever fully justify. Now for Part 5, the progression of character arcs. There's actually a structural necessity to writing Heracles out of the narrative way back in Book 1. By having him abandoned in Mysia while he's off searching for Hylas, Apollonius is preventing Heracles' immense physical strength from totally overshadowing the rest of the crew. It's this brilliant, calculated structural cordon. He's clearing the narrative stage so the fragile, cooperative nature of the voyage can become the true focus of the epic. And the text explicitly justifies this removal through divine providence. The sea god Glaucus steps in and basically states that Heracles is fated to complete his own individual labors elsewhere. This intervention confirms the twilight of brute force. The gods themselves are decreeing that this quest has to be undertaken by a fragile mortal collective. It depends on a delicate balance of effort and strategy, not just the raw, overwhelming power of one man. So without a mega champion to swoop in and save them, we really get to see the psychological burdens borne by our two protagonists. Jason suffers this helpless brooding and total paralysis in the face of the fire-breathing bulls, and this is directly linked to Medea's measureless anguish. To save the collective, Medea has to commit to complete familial abandonment. She suffers deep, lasting psychological trauma over sacrificing her maidenhood, her home, and her own parents. And finally, Part 6, the transmission and enduring legacy of the text. The transmission of the Argonautica obviously starts with its Hellenistic origins in 3rd century BC Alexandria. But by the 1st century AD, we see Roman adaptations heavily expanding on its psychological themes, particularly Medea's internal conflicts. And from antiquity straight through to modernity, this text has been preserved, not as your standard run-of-the-mill myth of triumph, but as a pioneering masterclass in anti-heroic realism and a really intense study of collective human fragility. We can see this tension perfectly encapsulated in Apollonius' final address to the heroes in Book 4. He invokes a quote-unquote glorious end to their toils. But as a reader, having just tracked this rigorous ledger of grief, you immediately recognize the profound dissonance there. This glorious end is sharply, almost painfully contrasted with the deeply documented moral decay, the murders, the trauma, and the sheer human loss that the crew actually experienced. Which leads us to a final, rigorous provocation for this explainer. When you consider the true, unvarnished cost of ancient ambition presented in the text, you really have to ask, does the acquisition of the Golden Fleece, a prize heavily tainted by betrayal and blood, truly justify the devastating physical, psychological, and moral toll exacted upon its seekers? It's a haunting question, and it's one Apollonius forces us to grapple with, ultimately reshaping our understanding of the epic tradition forever.